The great halls of the Volanthi diplomatic station stretched for miles in every direction, and their crystal walls shimmered with the light of 1,000 captured stars that the Empire had conquered over 12,000 years of endless expansion across the galaxy. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked through these halls with her head held high, even as dozens of alien species turned to stare at her with eyes filled with pity and fear and something that looked very much like sorrow. She was the first human to ever set foot in this place, and she knew that every creature watching her had already decided that her species was doomed to the same fate that had claimed all the others: the forced slavery under the iron grip of the Volanthi hegemony. The Volanthi had ruled this part of the galaxy since before humanity had learned to make fire, and they had crushed every species they had ever encountered with brutal efficiency that left no room for resistance or hope. Elena had studied the records, and she knew what happened to species that refused to submit. Their worlds burned, their people scattered across mining colonies and labor camps, their cultures erased until nothing remained but servants who had forgotten they had ever been free. But she also knew something else, something that the Volanthi had never bothered to learn about: the small blue planet called Earth and the strange creatures who called it home. The main chamber opened before her like the mouth of some great beast, and she saw representatives from over 100 different species sitting in tiered rows that rose toward a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. At the center of it all sat High Archon Zelithra, supreme ruler of the Volanthi hegemony, a towering figure with 4 gleaming eyes and skin that shifted colors with every breath he took. His attendants surrounded him like worshippers around a god, and when he spoke, his voice echoed through the chamber with a power that made lesser beings tremble. "The human representative will approach," he commanded, and Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down upon her. She walked forward without hesitation, her footsteps steady on the smooth crystal floor, and she did not bow when she reached the speaking platform, a small act of defiance that sent whispers racing through the assembled delegates. "You stand before the Volanthi hegemony," Zelithra announced, his 4 eyes narrowing with what might have been amusement or annoyance, or both at the same time. "Your species has been observed for the past 50 of your years, and we have determined that you are suitable for integration into our great empire." He waved one of his long arms, and a bureaucrat in silver robes stepped forward to read from a glowing tablet that floated in the air before him. "The terms of integration are as follows." The bureaucrat droned in a voice that suggested he had read these same words 1,000 times before. "Humanity will surrender all claims to territorial sovereignty and recognize the Volanthi hegemony as the sole legitimate authority over all human worlds and colonies." Elena listened with a face that revealed nothing of the anger building inside her chest. "Humanity will submit to population quotas as determined by the Bureau of Resource Management, and all humans will be registered in the Imperial database for assignment to appropriate labor categories." The other delegates watched in silence, their expressions ranging from sympathy to indifference to barely hidden satisfaction at seeing another species brought low. "Humanity will provide biological resources for the military caste breeding programs, as is required of all client species within the hegemony." Elena's jaw tightened at those words, because she knew exactly what biological resources meant: human men and women taken from their families and used to create soldiers for an empire that cared nothing for their lives or their dignity. Failure to comply with these terms will result in pacification measures, the bureaucrat concluded, and he stepped back with a small bow toward the High Archon. Zelithra leaned forward on his throne, his 4 eyes fixed on Elena with the lazy confidence of a predator who has never known defeat. "You may now express your gratitude for the opportunity to serve the hegemony," he said, and his voice carried a tone that made it clear this was not a suggestion but a command. Elena stood in silence for a long moment, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath as they waited for her response. "These are not negotiations," she said finally. and her voice was calm and steady and carried to every corner of the vast room. "These are demands." A ripple of shock passed through the assembled delegates, because no species had ever dared to speak to the High Archon in such a manner. Zelithra's eyes blinked slowly, one pair after the other, and when he spoke again, there was an edge to his voice that had not been there before. "You misunderstand your position, human," he said with a patience that was clearly running thin. "Your species has existed for the blink of a cosmic eye, and you have accomplished nothing of significance in that time." He gestured dismissively with one hand, as if swatting away an annoying insect. "You have no fleet worthy of the name, no allies who would risk our displeasure, and no leverage of any kind." He leaned back on his throne and crossed his arms with an air of absolute certainty. "You will accept these terms, or you will be made to accept them. It makes no difference to me which path you choose." Elena looked at the ancient alien ruler for a long moment, and something shifted in her eyes, something cold and hard and utterly unafraid. She reached down and closed her diplomatic folio with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent chamber. Then she rose from her seat and turned toward the exit, her movements unhurried and deliberate. The gasps from the assembled delegates echoed through the crystal halls like the sound of breaking glass, and even Zelithra sat forward on his throne with genuine surprise on his alien face. "Where do you think you are going?" he demanded, and for the first time there was uncertainty in his voice. Elena paused at the threshold of the great doors, and she turned to look back at the High Archon with an expression that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his long life. "I am going home," she said, and her voice was quiet but carried the weight of something vast and terrible and inevitable. "I am going to tell my people what you are and what you have demanded of us." She paused for just a moment longer, and a small smile crossed her face, a smile that held no warmth at all. "And then, High Archon, you will learn something about humanity that your intelligence reports failed to mention." She turned and walked through the great doors without looking back, and the sound of her footsteps faded into silence. Zelithra sat on his throne, surrounded by his attendants and his delegates and his absolute certainty that the galaxy belonged to him. And he laughed at the foolish human who thought she could defy the might of the hegemony. But somewhere deep in the shadows of the chamber, Fleet Admiral Korath watched the empty doorway with eyes that had seen 100 species, crushed beneath the hegemony's heel. And for the first time in 300 years of loyal service, he felt something cold settle into his chest, something that might have been fear. He had read the human files more carefully than anyone else in the Empire, and he had seen things that made him question everything he thought he knew about the nature of war and survival. These humans were not like the other species the hegemony had conquered, and Admiral Korath had a terrible feeling that the Empire was about to learn this lesson in the worst possible way. But no one asked for his opinion, and so he kept his silence and began to make quiet plans of his own. The council chamber of the Volanthi hegemony had not witnessed such laughter in centuries, and the sound of it echoed off the ancient walls like the rumble of distant thunder. High Archon Zelithra sat at the head of the great table surrounded by his most trusted advisors, and every one of them was struggling to contain their amusement at the report they had just received. "The humans walked out," said Minister Vethna, his orange scales rippling with mirth as he repeated the words once more just to savor their absurdity. "They actually walked out of the peace talks as if they had some choice in the matter." The other ministers joined in the laughter, and soon the entire chamber was filled with the sound of a dozen different species, expressing their contempt for the foolish creatures from the small blue planet. "What did they think would happen?" asked General Kethrol, commander of the hegemony's ground forces. "Did they believe we would simply let them go and forget about them?" "Perhaps they thought their refusal would somehow impress us," suggested another minister with a cruel smile. "These primitives have such strange ideas about honor and dignity." Zelithra, allowed the laughter to continue for a few more moments before raising one hand to call for silence. "The human response is unfortunate but not unexpected," he said with a calm that came from absolute confidence in his own power. "Lesser species often require a demonstration of our strength before they understand their place in the natural order." He turned to Admiral Karth, who had remained silent throughout the meeting with an expression that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. "Admiral, you will dispatch the third subjugation fleet to the human territories immediately." Korath inclined his head in acknowledgement, but he did not speak right away. "High Archon," he said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a surgeon wielding a blade. "Perhaps we should gather more intelligence before we commit our forces to a campaign." The laughter died instantly, and every eye in the chamber turned toward the Admiral with expressions of disbelief. "More intelligence?" Zalathra repeated, his 4 eyes narrowing with displeasure. "We have observed these creatures for 50 years, Admiral. What more could we possibly need to know?" Korath stood his ground, even as he felt the weight of the Archon's disapproval pressing down upon him. "The humans have a rather unusual history, High Archon," he explained, pulling up a holographic display that showed the small blue planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. "They have spent most of their existence fighting among themselves with a brutality that exceeds anything we have seen from other primitive species." The display shifted to show images from human history, great battles where millions had died, weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light, wars that had consumed generations. "They split the atom and turned it into a weapon within years of discovering it," Korath continued, his voice carefully neutral. They have developed biological and chemical agents capable of wiping out entire populations, and they have shown a willingness to use such weapons on their own kind." Minister Vethner waved a dismissive hand at the display. "So they are savages who enjoy killing each other. This only proves how primitive they truly are. Or it proves how dangerous they can be when threatened," Korath replied quietly. The chamber fell silent once more, and Zalathra fixed the Admiral with a stare that had made stronger beings crumble. "You are afraid of these creatures, Admiral?" The question was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. To admit fear was to admit weakness, and weakness had no place in the hegemony's military command. "I am cautious, High Archon," Korath answered with a bow. "The humans have no significant fleet and no faster-than-light communication network that we have detected, but they have shown remarkable creativity in developing weapons of destruction." He paused, knowing that his next words could end his career or even his life. "I merely suggest that we take the time to understand them fully before we engage in military action." Zalathra stared at the Admiral for a long moment, and the tension in the chamber was thick enough to cut with a blade. Then the High Archon laughed, and the sound was cold and dismissive. "You are cautioned as you credit, Admiral, but it is misplaced in this case." He gestured at the holographic display with contempt. "These humans have a handful of warships armed with primitive railguns, and their fastest vessels cannot even approach 1/10 of light speed." He leaned forward, his 4 eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "The third subjugation fleet has 200 warships with shields that can withstand a direct nuclear strike, and weapons that can crack a planet in half." He waved his hand dismissively. "Send the fleet, Admiral. Give the humans 1 solar cycle to reconsider their foolishness, and if they do not submit, then burn their outer colonies as a lesson to the rest." Korath bowed once more, knowing that further argument would only make things worse. "As you command, High Archon." He turned and left the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that followed his departure. The other ministers exchanged glances, and more than a few of them wondered if the Admiral had lost his nerve after so many years of easy victories. "Pay no attention to Korath's concerns," Zalathra said with a dismissive wave. "He has grown old and cautious, and he sees threats where none exist." The ministers nodded in agreement, eager to please their master and equally eager to forget the uncomfortable images the Admiral had shown them. But later that night, when the council had dispersed and the chamber stood empty, Korath returned to his private quarters and began doing something he had never done before in 3 centuries of service to the hegemony. He started moving his personal assets out of the core systems quietly, carefully, through channels that could not be traced back to him. He transferred his family to a distant colony near the edge of explored space, and he made sure they had supplies and resources to survive on their own if necessary. And he compiled a detailed report on human military history that he encrypted with the highest level of security and stored in a location known only to himself. The report included footage from something the humans called the First World War, where millions of soldiers had charged into machine gun fire day after day because their commanders ordered them to do so. It included records from the Second World War, where human cities had been reduced to rubble and human populations had been systematically exterminated. And somehow humanity had kept fighting until one side achieved total victory. It included images from a place called Stalingrad, where human soldiers had fought each other room by room in frozen ruins, eating rats and boot leather to survive, refusing to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. And it included a single piece of footage that haunted the Admiral more than all the rest, a bright flash of light over a human city called Hiroshima, followed by a mushroom cloud that rose into the sky like the hand of an angry god. The humans had used that weapon on their own kind, and 3 days later, they had used another one on a different city. And still, the war had continued for several more days before one side finally surrendered. What kind of species could endure such destruction and keep fighting? What kind of species could inflict such horror on itself and still survive? Korath did not know the answers to these questions, but he suspected that the hegemony was about to find out in the worst possible way. He sealed his report and composed a message to his family, telling them that he loved them and that they should not expect to hear from him for some time. Then he put on his uniform and went to oversee the departure of the 3rd Subjugation Fleet, knowing in his heart that he was sending 200 warships to a fate that no one in the hegemony could possibly imagine. The fleet jumped to hyperspace 3 hours later, and Admiral Korath watched them go with the cold certainty that the galaxy was about to change forever. The 3rd Subjugation Fleet emerged from hyperspace in the Proxima Centauri system with all the confidence of a predator entering a pen full of helpless prey. 200 warships spread out in perfect formation, their weapons charged and their shields glowing with barely contained power, and on the bridge of the flagship, Commander Zeleth Kal-Nephew of the High Archon himself smiled at the display before him. "Scan the system," he ordered, leaning back in his command chair with the lazy arrogance of someone who had never known defeat. "Find me the human colonies so we can begin teaching these primitives their place." The sensor officer's fingers danced across his console, and for a long moment the only sound on the bridge was the gentle hum of the ship's systems. Then the officer looked up with an expression of pure confusion on his face. "Commander, I am detecting the colonies, but there are no life signs. The habitats appear to be completely empty." Zeleth Kal sat forward, his amusement fading into irritation. "Empty? Check your instruments again. They must be hiding somehow." "I have checked 3 times, Commander," the officer replied with growing nervousness. "The colonies are intact, but there is no one inside them. The power is down. The ships are gone, and the stations are completely abandoned." A murmur of confusion ran through the bridge crew, and Zeleth Kal felt something cold settle into his stomach. "They must have fled when they detected our approach," he decided, forcing confidence into his voice. "Cowards, they ran rather than face us." He stood and pointed at the main display. "Set course for the next system. We will chase them down and make them pay for wasting our time." The fleet jumped again, and again they found empty colonies and abandoned stations, and not a single human anywhere in sight. System after system told the same story. The humans had simply vanished like smoke in the wind, leaving behind everything they had built as if it meant nothing to them. By the fifth empty system, the crew was getting nervous, and even Zelithko could not hide his growing unease. "Where are they?" he demanded, pacing back and forth across the bridge. "A species cannot simply disappear. They must be somewhere." The communications officer suddenly looked up with alarm in his eyes. "Commander, I am detecting something strange. There are encrypted signals bouncing through the system in patterns I have never seen before." "What kind of signals?" "I do not know. Commander, they are using encryption methods that our computers cannot break, and they seem to be moving faster than any communication system we have on record." Selithkal felt the cold in his stomach grow colder, and he was suddenly very aware of how quiet space was around them. "The humans do not have faster-than-light communication," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our intelligence reports confirm this." "Perhaps our intelligence reports were wrong, Commander," the communications officer replied in a voice barely above a whisper. Before Zelithkal could respond, the sensor officer shouted in alarm. "Commander, I am detecting massive energy signatures along the outer rim of the system. Something is coming." The main display flickered and changed, showing a dozen points of light racing toward the fleet at impossible speed. "What is that?" Selithkal demanded, gripping the arms of his chair. "Projectiles, Commander, solid mass, approximately the size of a small building, traveling at approximately 80% of light speed." The bridge fell silent as the full horror of those words sank in. A projectile moving at 80% of light speed carried more kinetic energy than the fleet's most powerful weapons. And at that speed, there was no time to dodge and no shield that could stop it. "Evasive maneuvers!" Selithkal screamed, but he knew even as he gave the order that it was already too late. The first projectile hit the flagship dead center, punching through the shields as if they did not exist and tearing through the hull like a knife through paper. The explosion was blinding, and then there was only silence where the mightiest ship in the fleet had been. Chaos erupted across the remaining vessels as more projectiles came screaming out of the darkness, each one finding its target with perfect precision. Ships that had conquered 1,000 worlds vanished in flashes of light, their crews never even knowing what had killed them. The communications channels filled with screams and desperate orders and prayers to gods that could not save them. And through it all, a single thought echoed in the minds of those who lived long enough to think. The humans knew we were coming, and they were waiting for us. 11 minutes, that was how long the third subjugation fleet lasted against an enemy they had dismissed as primitives. 11 minutes from the first impact to the destruction of the last ship. Out of 200 warships and nearly 1 million crew members, not a single one survived to tell the tale. But the humans made sure the hegemony knew what had happened. They sent a message to the diplomatic station, a simple recording that showed the fleet's destruction from multiple angles. And at the end of the recording, a single line of text appeared on the screen in the universal language of the galaxy. "You were warned." When the message reached the hegemony's council chamber, Archon Zelithra watched it in complete silence, his 4 eyes fixed on the screen with an expression that shifted from disbelief to horror to cold fury. His nephew, his own blood, had been on that flagship. How is this possible? Minister Vethner whispered, his orange scales pale with shock. They had no fleet. Our spies reported nothing that could explain this. Their spies saw what the humans wanted them to see, Admiral Korath said quietly from his place in the shadows. Every eye in the chamber turned to him, and for once no one laughed at his caution. They knew we were coming before we even left, Korath continued, his voice heavy with the weight of vindication that brought him no joy. They evacuated their civilians to locations we do not know, and they set up kill zones using weapons they never showed us. He pulled up a tactical analysis on the display, showing the trajectory of the projectiles that had destroyed the fleet. These weapons were launched from platforms hidden in the outer system, accelerated to relativistic speeds, using technology we did not know they possessed. He looked directly at the High Archon, and there was no fear in his eyes, only grim certainty. We did not invade their space. High Archon, we walked into a trap that they had been preparing since the moment Ambassador Vasquez walked out of those doors. Zelithor's hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with rage. Then, we will send more ships, the 5th Fleet, the 9th Fleet, every ship in the Armada if necessary. And how many of them will return? Korath asked quietly. The question hung in the air like poison, and no one had an answer. But Zelithor was not willing to accept defeat. Not from a species that had been building mud huts when his ancestors ruled the stars. Prepare the full armada, he commanded, his voice cold with determination. 2,000 ships, the largest force assembled in 3,000 years. He turned to face the council with fire burning in his 4 eyes. We will find these humans wherever they are hiding, and we will make them pay for every drop of Volanthi blood they have spilled. The ministers nodded in agreement, their fear overwhelmed by wounded pride and thirst for revenge. Only Korath remained silent, watching the display that still showed the wreckage of the 3rd Fleet drifting through empty space. And somewhere in the darkness of human territory, Ambassador Elena Vasquez received word of the fleet's destruction and allowed herself a single moment of grim satisfaction. Phase 1 complete, she said to her staff. Now we show them what humanity can really do. The great armada of the Volanthi hegemony assembled at the edge of human space like a swarm of angry predators. 2,000 warships representing the combined military might of an empire that had never known defeat. Archon Zelithra himself had come to witness the destruction of humanity, traveling aboard the Imperial Dreadnought that served as the mobile heart of his empire. Today we avenge the 3rd Fleet, he announced to his commanders through a system-wide broadcast. Today we show these humans what happens to those who dare to challenge the hegemony. The fleet jumped into human territory, expecting a desperate last stand, expecting terrified defenders fighting hopelessly against impossible odds. Instead, they found an asteroid field, millions of rocks drifting through the darkness of space, each one seemingly harmless. Scan the area, the fleet commander ordered, and the sensor arrays reached out to probe the asteroids for signs of human defenses. The scans came back clean, no weapons, no ships, no threat of any kind. They are hiding, the commander decided. Move the fleet through the field and proceed to the next system. The first wave of ships entered the asteroid field with shields raised and weapons ready. And for several minutes nothing happened. Then the asteroids began to move. Hidden thrusters fired on hundreds of rocks at once, sending them spinning toward the hegemony ships at speeds that made them impossible to avoid. But these were not ordinary asteroids. Each one had been hollowed out and filled with autonomous weapons that activated the moment they detected enemy shields. Railguns opened fire from every direction, their projectiles small but numerous enough to overwhelm point defense systems. Missiles launched from hidden tubes, seeking out engine signatures and shield generators with merciless precision. And some asteroids simply exploded when ships got too close, their cores packed with antimatter that turned everything within 1,000 kilometers into expanding clouds of plasma. The vanguard of the fleet was destroyed in minutes, and the rest retreated in chaos as the asteroid field came alive around them. Fall back, the commander screamed. Regroup at the outer system. But the humans were not finished. As the fleet retreated, they found more surprises waiting for them. Gas giants that had seemed empty now revealed defense platforms hidden deep within their atmospheres, protected from sensors by the swirling storms that surrounded them. These platforms launched torpedoes that rode the planet's magnetic field until they reached the edge of space. then accelerated toward the fleet with drives that left trails of fire across the darkness. The hegemony ships tried to flee into the corona of the system's star, hoping the heat and radiation would mask their signatures. Instead, they found human ships waiting for them, small, agile vessels with hulls that somehow withstood temperatures that should have vaporized them. These ships darted through the fire like demons born from the heart of a sun, striking at the hegemony fleet and vanishing before counterattacks could be launched. The Great Armada scattered across the system, each ship fighting alone against enemies that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. By the time the survivors regrouped at the rally point, they had lost over 500 ships, a quarter of their strength, and they had not destroyed a single human vessel. How is this possible? Zelathor demanded, his voice raw with disbelief as he watched the casualty reports scroll across his display. How can primitives who were building chemical rockets a century ago do this to us? Admiral Korath stood at the back of the command center, his face grim but unsurprised. They have been preparing for this moment since they first looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone, he said quietly. While we dismissed them as savages too busy fighting each other to pose a threat, they were studying us, learning our tactics, analyzing our technology, identifying our weaknesses. He stepped forward and pulled up a display showing the weapons that had devastated the fleet. These autonomous systems were designed specifically to counter our shield frequencies and our sensor capabilities. He switched to another image, the agile ships that had attacked from within the star's corona. These vessels use heat dissipation technology that we have never seen before, developed in secret shipyards we never knew existed. Zelathor stared at the display with growing horror as the true scope of humanity's deception became clear. They planned this from the beginning, he whispered. The peace talks, walking out, it was all a strategy to make us attack before we understood what we were facing. Korath nodded slowly. Ambassador Vasquez did not walk out because she was offended by our terms. She walked out because she wanted to make us angry enough to attack without thinking. He met the High Archon's eyes with a gaze that held no judgment, only truth. We fell into their trap exactly as they intended. That night, Zelathor retreated to his private chambers and did something he had never done before he accessed the complete human historical database that his intelligence services had compiled. He had dismissed this archive as the savage tales of a primitive species, but now he forced himself to watch with new eyes. He saw the trenches of the First World War, where millions of humans had died fighting over a few miles of mud, and where those who survived had climbed out of their holes and charged again the next day. He saw the siege of Stalingrad, where human soldiers had fought each other hand to hand in frozen ruins, starving and freezing and dying by the thousands, and neither side had been willing to surrender. He saw footage of a place called Normandy, where humans had charged directly into machine gun fire because the mission demanded it, knowing they would probably die, doing it anyway. And he saw the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima, that terrible bright flash that had killed 100,000 humans in an instant. But what truly horrified him was what happened next 3 days later. Another bomb fell on another city, and still the war continued. What kind of species could endure such destruction and keep fighting? What kind of species could watch 100,000 of their own people die in a single flash of light and respond by dropping another bomb 3 days later? Zelathor had conquered species that surrendered at the first sign of defeat, species that collapsed when their leaders fell, species that valued their individual lives too much to sacrifice them for an abstract concept like victory. But humans were different. They did not surrender when defeat seemed certain. They did not collapse when their leaders died. And they seemed perfectly willing to sacrifice millions of their own people if victory demanded it. And the most terrifying realization of everything the humans had done to each other throughout their history, they had done while fighting amongst themselves. These wars had not been fought against aliens or monsters. They had been fought between different groups of humans, people who shared the same planet and the same basic nature. If this was what humans did to each other, what would they do to an enemy who had threatened to enslave their children? Zalathra sat alone in the darkness of his chamber, surrounded by the ghosts of the fleet he had sent to their deaths. And for the first time in his long life, he understood what it felt like to face an enemy he could not defeat. The humans were not primitives who had gotten lucky. They were a species forged in the fire of constant warfare, tempered by millennia of killing each other. And now they had turned all that terrible experience against an empire that had never faced a true challenge. He thought of Admiral Korath's warning, dismissed so casually in the council chamber, and he felt something he had never felt before: regret. But regret would not bring back the dead, and it would not save the hegemony from the consequences of his arrogance. Somewhere in the darkness of human space, Ambassador Elena Vasquez received the latest casualty reports and nodded with grim satisfaction. "They are beginning to understand," she said to her staff. "Now we make them an offer they cannot refuse." The crystalline halls of the Volanti diplomatic station were quieter now, and the silence carried the weight of defeat that no one dared acknowledge. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked through those halls for the second time, but everything had changed since her first visit 1 year ago. The seats that had been filled with delegates from 100 subjugated worlds were now half empty, their occupants lost in the disastrous campaigns against humanity, their fleets scattered, their power broken. High Archon Zalathra sat upon his throne at the center of the chamber, but he no longer looked like a god surveying his domain. His ceremonial robes hung loose on his frame, and his 4 eyes were dim with exhaustion and something that might have been despair. The great hegemony had lost over 1,000 ships and millions of soldiers in the past year, and they had gained nothing except a deeper understanding of how badly they had underestimated the creatures from the small blue planet. "You wish to speak," Elena said as she reached the speaking platform, and her voice carried no hint of triumph or gloating, only cold, professional calm. Zalathra looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice with emotions he could barely control. "We are prepared to offer terms," he said, and each word seemed to cause him physical pain. "Recognition of human sovereignty over all your current territories, complete withdrawal of hegemony forces from your space, and financial reparations for no." The single word cut through the chamber like a blade, and every being in the room turned to stare at the human ambassador with shock on their faces. Zalathra's 4 eyes blinked in rapid succession, unable to process what he had just heard. "No?" he repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "We are offering you everything you demanded. We are offering peace." Elena stepped forward, and something in her eyes made the guards on either side of the throne take an involuntary step back. "1 year ago, you told me that humanity had no fleet, no allies, and no leverage," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "You were wrong on all 3 counts." She gestured at the assembled delegates, many of whom were watching with undisguised hope burning in their eyes. "We built the fleet in shipyards, hidden in asteroid fields and gas giant moons, places your surveys never thought to look, because you assumed we were too primitive to have secrets worth keeping." She turned to address the other species directly. "Our allies? Every species you have subjugated over the past 12,000 years has been feeding us intelligence for months." A ripple of shock ran through the hegemony officials, and more than a few of them turned accusatory stares toward the alien delegates. "They told us your patrol routes and your sensor blind spots and your shield frequencies," Elena continued with a cold smile. "They told us about your supply chains and your command structures and the locations of your repair facilities." She looked back at Zalathra. "They remember what freedom felt like, High Archon, and they have been waiting for someone strong enough to help them take it back." Zalathra gripped the arms of his throne, his claws leaving deep gouges in the ancient crystal. Even with your hidden fleet and your stolen intelligence, you cannot defeat the entire hegemony, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. We still have thousands of ships, millions of soldiers. You may have won battles, but you cannot win the war. Elena's smile faded, replaced by an expression of deadly seriousness. You are correct that we cannot defeat your entire military through conventional warfare. The cost would be too high, even for us. She reached into her coat and produced a small device that she placed on the speaking platform. That is why we chose a different approach. The device activated, projecting a holographic display that showed 17 points of light scattered across the galaxy, each one marking a hegemony core world, including the Volanthi homeworld itself. What is this? Zelithra demanded, leaning forward with growing alarm. Insurance, Elena replied. 6 months ago, while your fleets were chasing shadows in our territory, we launched relativistic kill vehicles toward every major world in your empire. The chamber erupted in chaos, delegates screaming, officials shouting, guards reaching for weapons, but Elena's voice cut through the noise like a knife. They are traveling at 90% of light speed, and they were launched from positions so far away that they cannot be intercepted. She waited for the noise to die down before continuing. Each vehicle carries a payload sufficient to sterilize an entire planet, and there are multiple vehicles, targeting each world. Zelithra's face had gone pale, his skin losing its color as the full horror of her words sank in. You would commit genocide? He whispered. You would murder billions of innocent people? Elena met his eyes without flinching. You threaten to enslave our children and breed our people like livestock, she said quietly. We are simply demonstrating that we are capable of defending ourselves by any means necessary. She gestured at the holographic display. Fortunately, we do not wish to commit genocide. We are not monsters, whatever your propaganda may claim. The display shifted, showing a complex technical diagram. Each kill vehicle carries a self-destruct system that can be activated remotely. A single signal from this station will detonate the payloads, harmlessly in deep space. She looked directly at Zelithra. We have transmitted the activation codes to your technicians. You can verify their authenticity for yourself. For a long moment, no one spoke. The entire chamber held its breath as the High Archon processed everything he had just learned. What do you want? He asked finally, and his voice was the voice of a being who had lost everything he thought he knew about power and control. Elena straightened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every human who had ever dreamed of reaching the stars. The Volanthi hegemony is over, she said. Today, you are going to announce free elections for every world in your empire, genuine elections with genuine choices, not the puppet shows you have used to maintain the illusion of consent. She paused to let her words sink in. You are going to dissolve your military caste and release every conscripted soldier to return to their homeworlds. Another pause. And you are going to spend the next century providing resources and assistance to help repair the damage your empire has done to the species you have oppressed. Zelithra stared at her in disbelief. You would destroy everything we have built over 12,000 years? We would give every species in this room the chance to build something better, Elena replied. She turned to address the assembled delegates, and her voice softened with something that might have been compassion. Humanity did not come here to conquer. We have seen what conquest does to both the conquered and the conquerors, and we want no part of it. She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. We came here to ensure that no species, including our own, ever has to kneel again. The delegates looked at each other, and slowly, hesitantly, hope began to bloom on faces that had known nothing but despair for generations. A delegate from a species called the Karathi rose to her feet, a small being with delicate features and eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. The humans speak truth, she said, her voice trembling. For 50 years they have treated us as equals, shared their knowledge without demanding tribute, defended our ships when pirates attacked. Another delegate stood, and then another, each one adding their voice to the growing chorus of support. They could have demanded anything in exchange for their help, but they asked only for friendship. They warned us that this day would come and asked us to trust them, and they have kept every promise. If the humans say they want freedom for all species, I believe them. Zelathra watched in silence as the chamber transformed around him, as the empire he had ruled for centuries crumbled not through military defeat but through something far more powerful: hope. Finally, he looked at Elena Vasquez, and there was something like respect in his ancient eyes, respect, and perhaps a grudging admiration for a species that had achieved what no other had ever managed. "You have won," he said quietly. "But I wonder if you understand the burden you have taken on maintaining peace is far harder than winning wars." Elena nodded slowly. "We know. We have been learning that lesson the hard way for our entire existence." She extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. "Do we have a deal?" Zelathra looked at her hand for a long moment, then reached out and clasped it in his own. "We have a deal." The chamber erupted in cheers that echoed through the crystal halls and out into the galaxy beyond. And somewhere in the crowd, Admiral Karath watched with tears streaming down his weathered face. He had spent his entire life serving an empire built on conquest and fear. And now he was watching that empire transform into something new, something better. Perhaps there was hope for the galaxy after all. Perhaps there was hope for everyone. As Elena Vasquez walked out of the diplomatic station surrounded by delegates who were already planning their first free elections in centuries, she allowed herself a small smile. The work was just beginning, and there would be challenges ahead that made the war seem simple by comparison. But humanity had faced impossible odds before, and they had always found a way. After all, that was what humans did best.